Good afternoon and welcome to everybody that's going to be participating in today's Shawnee County Historical Society program featuring Dave Fisher, who's going to be talking about his great-great-grandfather, who was an abolitionist and also involved in Quantrill's raid, not so much as a protagonist, but as one who was suffering from Quantrill's raid, which occurred in August of 1863. He's also a founder of the First Methodist Church here in town at 6th and Harrison. And I think most people probably know that. I'm really grateful for Dave to be there. I'm Bob Totten. I'm the Executive Director of Shawnee County Historical Society. Many of you folks are members, including Mark Horniak that I see right next to me. Good to see you, Mark. And if you haven't paid your dues or renewal dues, we'd sure like to have you pay us $35 and send it to 2201, Box 2201, Topeka. You could also be a member as a household family, patron, renovator, or sustainer. These programs, as well as a student, these programs are done at the request of our membership, and it has been very good for the last 2.5 years. As some of you know, we've had about 45 programs in that time frame. But Dave is a Mass Mutual insurance agent. He'd be glad to probably sell you some insurance today, but that's not really his vocation. His vocation is various topics of history. He's not what I would call a historian, but one who's just interested in a lot of things. And Dave, I'm going to just turn it over to you and let you tell us all about your great-great-grandfather.
Okay, be happy to try and do that. Yeah, my name is Dave Fisher, and the insurance agent business is something that I've done just on that's been my main occupation, but I've had a lot of other things that I've been involved with. One of the things is I have written 5 books, 2 of them on weight management. One of them, a joke book, when my wife passed away, why my kids talked me into writing the actual joke book of jokes that I'd accumulated that I'd made up for many years. Then I wrote a book called He's Here. And the one that I just finished is a book, it's a murder mystery called Who Killed Who? A Love Story. And it's about a Washburn student who actually works in the Westridge Mall, and he gets involved with some murders there and actually solves that, and through the forensic medicine program or science program at Washburn. I'm also a member of the Jayhawker Club, and this is kind of the reason that I'm putting on this presentation today. The Jayhawker Club is a literary club, and we put on programs for a group of doctors and lawyers and school teachers, business people, dentists, and so forth. And we pick a particular paper and we present it. And the paper I'm going to give today on a little bit of Kansas history is about my great-great-grandfather. But one of the little things that we do on these papers is that we title the paper, it's a tradition, we title the paper in such a way that it's very appropriate for the paper, but nobody can figure out what it's about until you start the paper. For example, I've given 7. The first paper I gave was titled Faster Than a Speeding Bullet. And this was a story about what it's like breaking the sound barrier in an American fighter. I did one on Before, which is the actual history of Burnett's Mound and what I think you'd find before the Big Bang. The third paper was titled You Can Take It With You. And I actually developed the first pocket computer system in the country. And it's the story of how you can take your computer with you. And we later even developed the software for Tom Osborne at the University of Nebraska for football scouting. The fourth paper was titled A Little Bit of Kansas History. And that's the one I'm going to be presenting here just in a minute. The fifth paper was titled Light Brown Hair and Blue-Green Eyes. And that's a story of Joan of Arc. I've done quite a lot of research on that, and I have been to France 5 times, and it's the story of Joan of Arc told from the viewpoint of you're actually watching her as she carries on the various escapades that she did. My 6th paper is titled He's Here, and that's also a title of one of the books that I wrote, and that's the story of my experiences with God. And my 7th paper I just gave about a month and a half ago is titled A Discovery. I coached swimming for 11 years at the YMCA. A couple of years before that at the Shawnee Country Club, was a competitive swimmer at Topeka High, and also was the co-captain of the Washburn University swimming team. So the Discovery is a story of research that I did on Leah Thomas, the transgender swimmer that we're all hearing so much about when she won the 500-yard freestyle. So anyway, today's paper is titled A Little Bit of Kansas History. One of the most interesting dimensions of the world we live in is time. For example, if two friends are at an airport at the same time, in the same line, they would see each other. But if they just missed each other by a couple of minutes, they would never know they were there. If two cars are at the same spot in an intersection, there's a real problem. But if they're just a few seconds apart, everything is just fine. One of the most difficult things for us to do is actually experience a moment of time if we weren't there. Let's look at a few examples. If you fought in the Revolutionary War, you would tell an entirely different story than if you were reading about the Revolutionary War in a textbook. If you were watching a space shuttle launch in Florida and felt the ground shake and hear the noise of the rocket engines, you would tell an entirely different story than if you just watched it on TV. If you were there and watched the crucifixion of Jesus, you would tell a much different account than if you read it in the Bible. If you watched the movie Top Gun and observed the jet aircraft taking off, you would have an entirely different story to tell than if you were actually there and felt the aircraft carrier shake when the plane catapults off the deck. By just watching the movie, you wouldn't know that during flight operations, there's a tremendous smell of jet fuel and the powerful wind blowing in your face as the carrier heads into the wind. You wouldn't know about the feeling of salt water in the air and that you just have to wear ear protection because of the jet noise. So when I tell you about a little bit of Kansas history, I hope you'll try and feel it, hear it, smell it, and see the experience in your mind's eye. Many felt it was the most beautiful town in Kansas. It was located on the side of the Kansas River and had been founded in 1854. The town had grown and now had a population of around 1,200 men, women, boys, and girls. There were no paved roads, there were no automobiles. Just to the west of the peaceful little community were gentle rolling green hills that added to the beauty of the community. Each day you could hear the sounds of horses and wagons and carriages and the blacksmiths pounding horseshoes on their anvils. You could notice the birds singing, the wind blowing through the trees, and many other tropical summer noises. Charlie Hart was one of the residents of the small town for a short while, but he's gone now. It was basically a happy little place, but there had been rumors that had been spread around among the inhabitants for quite some time, but nothing had happened. So they just went on working and raising their families. On what was thought to be another typical hot August night, the town's residents went to bed, feeling the next day was going to be just another normal summer day in 1863. The next morning, around 4 o'clock, while most of the residents were still in bed, a few of them noticed the sound of mounted horses galloping east out of town. A short time later, there was the sound of gunfire. But wait, let's go ahead in time to the 1950s when I was a young boy growing up in Topeka. Like most students, I always look forward to summer vacation. School usually lasted until the end of May, and then it was followed by Memorial Day. On Memorial Day, my father and mother would load my sister Wendy and I into our family car with a bucket. We would drive a few blocks to the corner of 17th Street and to Gage Boulevard and turn west on 17th. In just a few blocks, we would see vendors selling flowers near the entrance of Mount Hope Cemetery, and we would get out of the car and pick out 16 peonies and put them in our bucket. Ed would then drive into the cemetery, and we would park on the road by the Singing Tower. After laying the peonies on the ground, we would fill the bucket with water, and Wendy and I would place a flower in the container by each of the 16 graves. Wendy and I didn't know anything about the graves other than they were just relatives. As we grew older, we began to find out who they were and what they did. 5 of the graves are people who lived in the little town in Kansas in 1863. They're the Reverend Hugh Dunn Fisher, also known as Chaplain Fisher, who was my great-great-grandfather. Elizabeth Fisher, his wife. Their 3 sons, John W. Fisher, my great-grandfather, C.E. Fisher, M.D., and Joseph C. Fisher. Their 4th son, Frank, is not buried in Mount Hope. Of course, there are other relatives buried there, but they are the ones that are part of this story. Hugh Dunn Fisher wrote the book, Gun and the Gospel, which along with many handed down family stories is the basis of this paper. Now let's go back in time to 1863. Who was Charlie Hart? Charlie Hart taught school in the local community for a brief time. He was associated with the wrong group of people, though he was run out of town. Who was Charlie Hart? He was actually William C. Quantrill. According to my great-great-grandfather, his name was spelled Quantrill. However, in later years, the I was replaced with an E in the last syllable. The town is Lawrence, Kansas. As I mentioned before, there had been rumors of an attack on Lawrence for quite some time, but nothing happened. The cry of wolf had been raised too often, so the town became literally unprotected. The well-planned raid on Lawrence by William Quantrill and his raiders was to occur on August 20th, 1863, but it actually happened on August 21st. One of Quantrill's spies actually lived in Lawrence in the Eldridge house as a cattle speculator and occasionally had wine with General Jim Lane. Quantrill had planned to kill Jim Lane, Chaplain Fisher, and Colonel Eldridge. The raiders consisted of 150 of Quantrill's men and 150 Texas Rangers. During the raid, men who lived in Lawrence were shot and killed in cold blood on their front porches, while their wives and children watched. After the raid, 154 of the best business houses and dwellings in Lawrence were burned to the ground. The property loss was valued back then to be $1.5 million. Two-thirds of Lawrence residents were homeless. Many did not even have a suit of clothing, and few had $1 of money. That night, nearly 100 widows and 200 fatherless children sat wailing in the streets. Beside the crying and sobbing crowd, there was a smell of smoke from the burning structures. A total of 185 men had been killed. It was one of the worst massacres of all time. Now let's go back in time to the morning of the raid. My great-great-grandfather, Chaplain Fisher, had been ill. At about 4 o'clock in the morning, he woke up to the sound of horses' hooves in the front of his house. He quickly got partly dressed and looked out the window and saw 3 horsemen rapidly riding out of town to the south. He told his wife, Elizabeth, he was afraid something terrible was going to happen. She just thought he was sick and nervous and that there had been a railroad meeting the night before, and some of the countrymen who had been there were probably just going out early to their farms. Chaplain Fisher felt easier and lay back down to rest. About a half an hour later, Elizabeth got up. It was dawn. She looked out a window and saw a body of troops entering the outskirts of Lawrence. She hollered, and I quote, "Pa, get up. There's a country of soldiers coming into town. I believe it's Quantrill and his men." He got up and went to the door just in time to see them shoot Reverend Snyder as he sat milking his cow in the front of his house, and confirmed his fears that Quantrill was upon them. He threw on his shirt and put on his shoes and went out of the house to the stable and turned his horse and pony loose so they would be less likely to be stolen. As I mentioned, Chaplain Fisher and Elizabeth had 4 children: John, who was then 12, C.E., who was 10, Joseph, who was 7, and Frank, who was 6 months old. Elizabeth earnestly told my great-great-grandfather to take John and C.E. and run about a quarter of a mile west to Mount Oread and hide in the bushes. As they started out, Chaplain Fisher saw pickets stationed every 100 yards or so, and he felt it would be impossible for him to get through their line alive. He figured the boys could run and get away. So while the boys ran for Mount Oread, he went back to his house as he was sick. John saw a school friend named Robbie, and they ran together. They killed Robbie by John's side, and his brains were spattered on John's face and frightened him so much he never fully recovered. C.E. caught up with Freddie Leonard, who was a year or 2 older, and they ran together. Somehow they evaded the pickets, but were shot at from a distance several times. They hid in the town cemetery. My great-great-grandfather went to his home and went down to the cellar, which was dirt. Elizabeth was afraid they would find him, but he was just too weak to leave. She replied, and I quote, Well, trust in the Lord and pray that he may save you. I will pray also and do all I can for you. Then she saw 4 murderous villains ride up to the front gate, dismount, and demand admittance. My great-great-grandfather was in the cellar, lying just below the front hall, and could hear every word they said. When they asked where Chaplain Fisher was, Elizabeth told them he had left with the little boys when they came to town. Using swear words, they said he was in the cellar. Elizabeth told them she didn't want them to swear in front of the children and told them to go into the cellar and look for themselves. They entered the house and walked right over where my great-great-grandfather was lying in the cellar below and looked down in the cellar, but it was dark. They asked Elizabeth for a candle so they could go down in the cellar, but she told them they didn't use candles. When we go to the cellar, we burn oil in a lamp, she said. At the raiders' request, she got an oil lamp. One of the men accidentally turned the wick down into the bowl and asked her for help. Elizabeth told him he had ruined it and that it would take at least a half an hour before the lamp would burn. While they waited, they ransacked the house. Then they asked if she had another lamp, and she told them yes, but it was upstairs. When they told her to go upstairs and get the lamp, she protested that she could not carry the baby and one of them must go up and get the lamp or hold the baby while she went for it. One of the men took Frank, the 6-month-old baby, and walked the floor cooing to keep him quiet while his mother went up for the lamp. Perhaps he wondered if the father, whose life they were seeking, had eyes like the baby's eyes, and what would become of the child if they took its father's life. When Elizabeth returned with the lamp, one of the men said, "Come on now, cock your revolvers and kill at sight." The cellar was not completed. Some of the dirt had been thrown up in a pile on one side, and my great-great-grandfather hid behind it. He lay as flat as he could with his face turned to the side. The lamp threw shadows on the bank of dirt, and they did not see him. They were just a few feet away. Chaplain Fisher could have touched the leader on the shoulder. The men then went back up from the cellar. They stole more things and then ordered the house burned. After the fire was started, they left one guard and the rest rode off to kill more people. The guard told Elizabeth that if there was anything she wished to save, he'd help her save it. She asked him to help her put out the fire, but he said if he did that, it would cost him his life. She told him if he wouldn't help to put out the fire, just get on your horse and ride off. He said he would, but it would do no good, for this one is one of the marked houses and it is bound to go, and then he rode off. Elizabeth fought the fire and dealt successfully with the other raiders so they didn't go down into the cellar. A neighbor lady came over, and since there were raiders all around the house, Elizabeth whispered to her that my great-great-grandfather was in the basement of the burning house. They told Chaplain Fisher to come up to the first floor, and Elizabeth dropped a dress over his head and shoulders. Then under a carpet that she and the neighbor lady were holding, my great-great-grandfather crawled on the ground and followed them to a bush while 4 guerrillas standing by the fence not 80 yards away watched the 2 women with guns in their hands. The neighbor lady called to Elizabeth loudly, "Let's throw these chairs and things on top of the carpet. What's the use of saving anything from that old burning house and then have them burn up outside?" They kept the 3 chairs as heirlooms. Chaplain Fisher laid there until 11 o'clock in the morning, and then the murders left town. John came back a little later and was told of his friend's death. Elizabeth was frantic, and fearing C.E. had been killed, she went out to find him. After about a mile, she saw C.E. and his friend and told them everyone in the family was alive. When they were all reunited, they knelt on the ground and thanked God for their safety. The question was often asked of Elizabeth, and I quote, "Mrs. Fisher, how could you keep your courage and confidence and do so much to save your husband?" And always her reply was, "The Lord help me. Has he not said, 'Call upon me in the day of trouble, and I will deliver thee, and thou shalt glorify me'?" Who were the characters in the story in the cemetery? Reverend Hugh Dunn Fisher was my great-great-grandfather. As I mentioned before, he wrote the book, Gun and the Gospel. He released the first slaves in Kansas. He brought them from Missouri. When they crossed the border, he rose up in his saddle, turned around, and with his hands in the air, he shouted, "You're free." And they all cried. He officiated at Senator Jim Lane's funeral and was later asked to take his place as a United States Senator from Kansas. He declined as he felt he was needed more to do God's work in Kansas. He started the First United Methodist Church in Kansas. Through Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's writings, Sherlock Holmes once said, "Any intelligent man can only come to one conclusion: there has to be a God." I'm sure my great-great-grandfather would now agree. Elizabeth Fisher, his wife, was my great-great-grandfather. They had 4 sons that were in the cemetery. John W. Fisher, my great-grandfather, he was the first student at the University of Kansas. C.E. Fisher, M.D., their second son, was the second student at the University of Kansas. Joseph C. Fisher was their third son, and he was the 7-year-old boy who stood by his mother's side during the raid. Frank Fisher was their 4th son, who is not buried in Mount Hope, and he was the 6-month-old baby who softened the heart of one of the raiders. Hugh T. Fisher is John's son and my grandfather. He was an attorney, a Shawnee County District Attorney, and state senator. And that's a little bit of Kansas history. Again, to quote Sherlock Holmes, "Education never ends, Watson. It's a series of lessons with the greatest, the last." I'm sure my great-great-grandfather is now experiencing that last lesson right now. As each of us continue to enjoy the miracle of life through the good and bad history of the past, let us remember that we are the ones who will create the future, which will one day become history. I encourage all of us to go out and make history that will have a positive impact on our wonderful state and world. And that's the title, or the paper, A Little Bit of Kansas History. Now, I'm going to tell you a few other little interesting stories. One of my dad's partners in his law firm was garage sailing. And one day he called me up and he said, "Dave," he said, "I found a book at a garage sale." He said, "I thought you might like it. I bought it, but if you just want to pay me what I bought for it, I'll give it to you." And this is the book that he got, which is The Gun and the Gospel. Most of the books are in black, but this one happens to be kind of a reddish color. On the inside of the book, very interesting, on the inside of the book is, get this over to the right spot. There it is. Figure out how to move this, kind of like brushing your teeth. Anyway, what that is that is his actual stamp. Where is that? There it is. Hugh D.D. Fisher and his address in Topeka, Kansas. I think this is his original copy because no one would have put their stamp on it for something like that. Now, a little more of the history that ties into the University of Kansas. My dad and mom met each other at KU, got married, and it's been very important. KU's been very important to them. When my mom died, my dad established a fund because she loved psychology. And they established a fund at the University of Kansas, and every other year they bring in a speaker, a renowned psychologist in the United States. They bring them in and put on an all-day seminar for the psychology students at KU. My mom's sister was the head of the mechanical engineering department at the University of Kansas, and he invented the variable pitch airplane propeller, the carburetor for Clinton and Briggs and Stratton, which allows each one of us to have a power lawnmower. He developed a delivery system on the 2 bombs that were dropped in Japan. In fact, we would watch some specials occasionally, and he would just kind of chuckle when they would explain how the bombs were delivered and so forth. He said, "No, it didn't happen like that at all." But he didn't say anything further about that as far as the public was concerned. And then he was on Operation Blue Book. And Operation Blue Book was in Roswell, New Mexico, and the government sent him down to investigate the UFOs. And he would never tell anything about it. But when we would have Thanksgiving meal, why my uncle and his family would be with us and so forth, and my mom would always say, "George, were there really UFOs?" And my mom's first name was Fern, and he'd say, "Yes, Fern, there are UFOs." And he said every night this little green spaceship lands in our backyard and these little green men file out and have dinner with Ruth and I. And then, of course, he would just chuckle and say, no, he said, I can never tell that. And at his 50th wedding anniversary several years ago, he was sitting at a table by himself for a few minutes. And I went over to him and I said, Uncle George, are there really UFOs? And he got this big smile on his face. And he said, David, he says, no. He says, I can't say anything about that. He said, I never will be able to. And so he never did tell any of us whether that was the truth of what he had learned as far as the UFOs are concerned. So from his standpoint, nobody knows. Now, it's kind of interesting, that story, because several years ago, I was on the Topeka High School Historical Society board of directors, and we were inducting some people into the Hall of Fame. There was a lady there, and we just kind of chatted over a cup of coffee. And I told her, I said, well, what do you do? And she said, well, I'm a teacher of psychology at KU. I said, oh, really? I said, my dad established a scholarship fund to bring in a speaker. She said, is your mother Fern Fisher? And I said, yeah. Oh, she said, that's something that's very, very important to the psychology department. We need to invite you to come to the next meeting. Well, I didn't really have that much of an interest in it, but I was talking to my son, Trey, and he said, oh, Dad, he said, we've got to go. He said, that's something that was your mom's thing. He said, we really need to go. So we went there. And I sat there and listened with my son, and they were kind of talking over my head on psychology. I didn't understand what they were in depth talking about and so forth. But after it was over, the head of the department came over to Trey and I, my son, and said, I'd like to take you over to the hotel on top of the hill here, and where we're having a reception. And he said, I'd like to visit for a little bit. So we did. We went over and we had a nice visit and so forth. And I told him the story of my Uncle George. And I told him all about the carburetor and the variable pitch airplane propeller and so forth. And after, he was very nice and said, just kind of nodded, but I got the feeling he didn't believe me. Or thought I was kind of exaggerating. So as Trey and I were going back to our car after we left the little reception and so forth, I told him, I said, Trey, I don't think that the head of the department really believed those stories. I thought I was probably exaggerating. And Trey said, yeah, I think he probably did too. That was on a Friday. The next Monday morning, I opened up my email, and here was a full report of an interview that had been done by the University of Kansas Radio. And in that interview, my uncle had documented everything that I had told the head of the psychology department, which was I thought was kind of an interesting story. So anyway, that's a little bit of Kansas history and a little bit of my history as far as my relatives are concerned, and the University of Kansas, which has been a very important family tradition going there. My sister graduated from there. I went there for a year and a half, but because I wanted to get a degree in physical education, exercise science, I transferred to Washburn, which they had a little more in-depth program at that time than KU did. Back then, it was basically just for athletes. Now that's changed. So anyway, I'd be happy to answer any questions, but I want to mention that I am not an expert on Quantrill's raid. All I'm really an expert on is understanding from the stories told down by my family and from reading the documentation of the gun and the gospel, why all of the quotes that are in there that I gave are just actually right out of the book that he put in when he wrote the book. So I'll be happy to try and answer any questions or anything else you'd like to discuss.
You'll need to unmute your mic if you do have a question. We're open for any of it. And one of the things that I wanted to mention while people are thinking about that and unmuting is I probably missed this. I had a couple of phone calls in the middle of this, but what made Quantrill's people want to be bothering your great-great-grandfather?
That I have absolutely no idea. He was one of the three marked people. And
the other two, one was, I believe, Jim Lane, wasn't it?
Yes, Jim Lane was, and the other was Eldridge, Colonel Eldridge.
Oh yeah, okay, of the hotel.
Yes.
Well, I just wondered, and you don't have the answer, but that's the way it goes. Anybody else have questions? Please.
Did Quantrill's raiding party get either of the other two that were on the list?
I don't know the answer to that either. I know when Jim Lane died, I know that was when my great-great-grandfather was asked to take his place in the Senate and turned it down because he felt that his primary job was God's work in Kansas. So he decided that he wouldn't take that position.
Jim Lane died in 1865 in Leavenworth, so he apparently survived the raid, and I'd heard that he had hidden in a cornfield and left. I don't know about Colonel Eldridge. I think it was Colonel Eldridge, but I'm not sure if that's his title.
Yeah. One of the interesting stories, I gave this same program at my civic club just to be here. In fact, last Wednesday, because they needed a speaker at the last spot. And I said, well, I'm going to give this on Sunday, so I'll go ahead and do it now, which I did. And one of the people there told me, said by the name of Joe Zima, he said, well, you really ought to add this at the end of your talk. He said, my great-great-grandfather was outside of Lawrence, and he was plowing the field when the raiders rode by. And he said they shot him. And they hit his hat, shot him in the head, or in the hat, and his hat flew off, and he fell off of his horse and faked that he was dead, and they went on and didn't bother him. And he said, my great-great-grandfather would tell the relatives down, I don't know whether he still found the hat, but he said he always showed everybody his hat and the hole that was in it, because the bullet went right through his hat.
Got a question on chat. Ask, when did your great-grandfather move to Topeka? And I assume with the stamp said he was living at 10th and Fillmore.
That's right. That's right. I don't know the exact date that he moved here, but he was also a member of the First United Methodist Church for a while. And then my dad was a member of that church. In fact, the Hugh Dunn Fisher has been handed down. My dad's middle name is David Hugh Fisher. I'm David Hugh Fisher Jr. And my son is David Hugh Fisher III, which we call Trey. So we've kept the name Hugh in the family names.
Do you by chance know how old your grandfather was during the raid?
I don't, but he wasn't that old, because remember, his children during the raid were 12, 10, 7, and 6 months.
You recall when he was born? Because we do the math. 1863 minus whatever.
I think I might have that in my phone. I'm not sure.
Sounds like it would have been 28 or 30. I don't know.
I just, yeah. No, I have Hugh T. Fisher in there, but not Hugh Dunn Fisher. I'm sorry.
Okay. Other questions, people?
I think the best part of that story is that it really brings not just history into it, but it also brings the feelings that were occurring with the people that were there. One of the things that really struck me was they just shot the reverend that was next door, who was milking his cow just in cold blood. They just went by and just killed him. I mean, it was not, nobody had a chance. It was just, I mean, if they had, remember when they went down to get him in the cellar, they said to shoot on sight. Not, they went down with their guns cocked, ready to just go ahead and shoot. And he was so close that he laid his head flat, because if his head had been just on its, just back, like he was laying back like that, it would have been higher up and they would have been able to see him. So he laid it just as close as he could to the ground.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Yeah. A couple of things. One is I can contribute something I learned from the book, The Devil Knows How to Ride. He talks about how the kill list in Lawrence was developed, and it describes a number of spies and scouts that went into Lawrence beforehand, including Henry Wilson and John Noland, who were black, and also some white spies. But their source was women. It was I suppose slavery supporting or abolitionist hating women were they made the list. Townspeople. The other thing I wanted to ask is, in the book, or this could be a question for you, Bob, or for anybody, is there a man whose last name is Blue Jacket mentioned in it?
Not that I recall.
Okay. yeah, the only thing I know about him was he was in the Indian Guard, and he was there the next day. I mean, he was obviously, soldiers and law enforcement and all that were late. He was there the next day. I know his great granddaughter. That's all.
Yeah, there was the part of it that I thought was kind of intriguing is they had kind of suspected this for quite some time, but just kind of the story of crying wolf. I mean, they were ready, and finally they just kind of didn't pay any attention anymore. And it's kind of like when we had the June 8th, 1966 tornado. We had tornadoes and warnings so long, and then all of a sudden here comes the real thing. And fortunately, the weather people kept us posted, but we had lived under the threat of tornadoes for so long, a lot of people didn't take them seriously. We didn't.
Right. I read that too. I read that Lawrence dropped its guard.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
A long time.
They had no defense whatsoever. I don't even know. Surely they had a sheriff, but I don't know that. But for 150 of Quantrill's people plus the Texas Rangers, I mean, that wouldn't be much. One sheriff's not going to get very far.
Right.
It would have almost taken the cavalry or something like that at that particular point with that number of people coming through town.
You know, I don't think this adds much, but in 1856, we had the sheriff of Douglas County actually was a pro-slavery person and ran a sack of Lawrence on May 21st, burning a couple of buildings and stole a cannon. So, I mean, there was fervor from at that point in time, 7 years earlier, of pro-slavery influence in the sheriff's, I think his name was Sam Jones. This may have no relevance 7 years later. I don't know.
Yeah, this was the Quantrill's raid was 2 years after statehood, so I would think not.
Yeah.
And isn't it interesting how history kind of repeats itself, because now we're having the same, look at all the issues that we're having dividing everyone as far as the legislation is concerned right now in the Kansas House and Senate. So it just seems like there's just always these opposing, one side's very strong on one side and the other on the other. And it seems like the real answers seem to always be kind of in the middle.
There's a book that's kind of hard to come by. I found it in the Tecumseh North Elementary Library of all places, but there's a book about the history of the little town of Tecumseh, which is in Shawnee County. But Tecumseh was actually a pro-slave community, and Topeka was a free state community, and that's why Topeka ended up being the county seat. Tecumseh had actually been platted to be larger than Topeka, but because Topeka was a free state community, I think it was at night, a group came out and raided Tecumseh and took the county records into Topeka so that they could establish it as the county seat. But you know that the slave versus free state issue just affected the whole area. It wasn't just Lawrence, and I think that someplace I read that the efforts the thrust of Quantrill's raid was to try to kill anybody who might be a free state supporter and also or an anti-slave supporter, and then anybody also who might be eligible to be part of the Civil War, to be to serve. And that's why they went after some younger boys. It's kind of surprising that the 12-year-old survived, because they were going after young men as much as they were some of the others.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, he survived only because he was able to get through the line and hid, because he got clear out of Lawrence. But yeah. Interesting. I did not know about that, but that's interesting how Topeka. I know my great grandfather was obviously against slavery. And that was one of the primary reasons Quantrill's raiders were after him, was because of his stand on freedom for slaves and so forth. I remember Judge Rogers. One time he was my dad's next door neighbor, and I got to know him fairly well. And he sent me some material one time, and it was the article that he got, I think, out of the book that someone had just mentioned. But in there, he said, "Yep," he said, "your great great grandfather released the first slaves in Kansas." So he thought that was quite a big thing. He was kind of a follower of that.
I got here kind of late, so I apologize. What was the Confederate government's position on Quantrill and his gang?
I have no idea. Does somebody know the answer to that?
Well, it was like a lot of partisan guerrillas in any conflict. In Ukraine right now, you see Ukrainian partisans active in Crimea and Zaporizhia and all that. I had a my yeah, go ahead.
Around on me. That's all right.
Pardon?
Oh, no.
I think somebody's just
Just
unmuted.
unloading them, you know.
I think they're on.
I don't know. They sold meat.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm relatively sure that Quantrill support warriors were not, if it were their Confederate pensions, wouldn't be eligible for those, that kind of thing. My great grandfather rode with Quantrill on Lawrence.
Oh, he did.
Yeah,
Interesting.
I'm a Topekan too. I would love to talk to you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. So
Well, I
is
think the
what is
Raiders,
your viewpoint of Quantrill's Raiders?
Pardon me?
I think
What is your viewpoint of Quantrill's Raiders? How do you look at it?
Well, I'm working on my own book, and it's until about yesterday, the thesis of it has been the thesis that you stated, which is the thesis of it was, why did all this happen? Can't we get along? Can't we get along better? Can't we not kill each other? And as you described it, sort of being like the present day. We learned at West Avondale Elementary in the early 60s, it was brother against brother. I had three cousins, first cousins of my great grandfather, who were in the Battle of Blackjack at John Brown's side. So it, and their parents were brothers and lived next door to each other. And one brother was abolitionist and the other was a slaveholder. So there you are. I mean, I don't know that I've even answered the question. I don't even remember what the question was.
Well, the question was your stand on whether you thought that Quantrill was doing the right thing or not.
Well, I've tediously gone through and documented the Dickens out of, I haven't counted, but like 8 relatives, including my great great grandparents who were slaughtered by the Redlegs. And my great grandfather rode with Quantrill in immediate response from that. So, and the guys who were slaughtered by the Redlegs were, it's pretty well documented, were
oh crap.
were unarmed, not resisting. For example, there was a fellow named Martin Rice, who's one of you well-read historical folks might run into. Martin told the Federals, and it was from the Kansas Jayhawker Regiment. So the same thing as the Red Legs. Martin told them when they asked that his neighbor had given hay and oats to Quantrill's horses, just as my other members of my family did. I mean, that happened to be the one that was close by. So they go and kill everybody at his farm. They were one of them had served for 2 weeks in the KCMO militia, secessionist militia at the outset, and then none of those guys provided service to the Confederacy. So I've just been pretty absorbed with the bloodshed and slaughter at the hands of, people from Lawrence, and I feel their rage right now because I've just been reading it.
I think what you're really saying in that case is that there was atrocities on both sides. And, you talk about brother against brother at times. I wonder if that's not the way it is. And sometimes we have over Thanksgiving Day where we discuss politics, and there are certain people of my family don't have the same view as the others. And I don't think they're as strong passionately as we might have experienced in years past, but it does get pretty loud sometimes. And I think that probably happens with every family. They don't agree with your sister or your brother or your uncle or whomever on some issue.
Yeah.
And it went farther. But the atrocities, we talk about the Red Legs and his concerns about that. And if you were of the Red Legs Jayhawkers position, you thought that was right. But at the same time, there were atrocities that we've seen and talk about with Quantrill's raid too, and other places. I mean, Jim King wasn't the greatest guy in Missouri and caused a lot of problems over in Osceola and other places.
Nobody ever points it. No woman was raped or assaulted in Quantrill's raid. It didn't happen.
Hmm.
So sure, I say sure, he slaughtered scores of men, and that's that's not to be treated lightly, but it wasn't standardless.
Does anybody other have any comments or questions that we can't answer?
I thought it was interesting that so many Texas Rangers came up and joined Quantrill because there weren't that many Texas Rangers.
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting. Yeah. Yep, that was.
Any idea why?
I don't know.
Hmm.
Yeah, there were 150. Yeah, there was even 150 Quantrill's men and 150 Texas Rangers. According to
I would thought that down in Texas, like.
I had another shirt tail ancestor who rode with the Texas Rangers in the 1850s. And basically his group tracked down some Indians who were stealing chickens and killed them and skinned them for leather. And so he left the Rangers. So I don't have a very high opinion of him.
Yes. I have a comment.
Please, go ahead.
I just read a book by Topeka author Thomas Fox Averill called Found Documents of Nell Johnson Dorr. And she was, it's archival fiction. And she was a resident of Lawrence during the raid. And Dr. Averill, his premise is that Quantrill led a group of Confederate guerrillas, and they came and destroyed Lawrence because of the slavery issue. Nell and her husband and other people in Lawrence at that time wanted KT, Kansas Territory, to be a free state. And Quantrill came and destroyed killed a lot of the townsmen because of the slavery issue. He was pro-slavery.
Mhm.
Any comments?
No, I think that's right. When confronted with that, my reflexive response is that my great grandfather didn't ride because of slavery. He rode because of fury. And I do know from a variety of sources that Quantrill, when he was recruiting his men, when he was accepting men, he wanted men who had seen their families murdered. That's the crowd he assembled. And so from not just for the Lawrence raid, but throughout. So Cole Younger, his dad had been killed. Jesse James, Frank James, they'd had some family killed. It was, and Quantrill was not the psychotic in that group. Bloody Bill Anderson and a couple of others were more craven killers than he was.
So perhaps revenge played a big part.
Yeah, a really big part.
Yeah.
Now, that said, my family owned slaves. My great-great-grandparents owned slaves. That's objectively true.
This is something I wish I knew more about, and it's too late now, but my maternal great grandmother grew up in St. Joe and knew Jesse James as a young man. And
Sure.
And when asked about that, she would just say, "Oh, he was just a punk," and that's all she would ever say about him.
Yeah, the real leaders in that gang were Frank James and Cole Younger. Those families were not as crazy as perceived. Jesse was the loose nut in that group. Jesse and Frank's stepfather had started William Julia University. Cole Younger's dad was a doctor. That's, they just got caught up in it. And of course, it's easy for me to say it was the Redlegs. More than that, deeper than that, further back than that, it was slavery. So sure.
Any other comments, questions, thoughts?
Not here.
Well,
Listen, I really appreciated Mr. Fisher's man, among other things, his great-great-grandfather's rage channeled through him, and I felt it and I connected with it. I mean, I really would like to buy you a cup of coffee, Mr. Fisher.
We'll have to do it sometime, maybe meet out at the mall or something.
Yeah, I will.
I agree. I think we all have learned some things today and heard things that I had not been aware of. And I see that on our chat, but a lot of folks have said the same things that have just been said. I do appreciate, Dave, your time and efforts. I'm glad Doug Wright encouraged you to be participating in one of these programs, and Christine picked up on it. And of course, as usual, I always appreciate those that have joined us for today's program. It's very helpful. We will be back next week with Curtis Pitts. He's going to be talking about I don't know what it's really called, school on the east side that started out as a Black vocational school, and then I guess got turned into a correctional facility. It's out there on 6th Street, and Curtis has some comments in regards to that. It'll be at 3 o'clock. Look forward to hearing from me in an email with the respective links. For those who just joined us, this has been recorded, so you can find it, probably in about an hour and a half, if I'm fast enough to get it done and turned around and put on the website like you guys would like to see it. we'll have that available for you later on. It's on events, 2023 events on our website, which is shawneecountyhistory.org. Again, if you are a member of ours, I'm glad you are. If you're not, we sure would encourage you to be a member of ours by joining us for $35 a year and send it to Post Office Box 2201. Dave Fisher, thank you very much for your time, effort, and presentation. We really do appreciate that.
Happy to do it.
And everybody else, thank you for being with us. And if you have anything of history or historical things that you think we should be aware of, please don't hesitate to get a hold of me or anybody that's associated with the Shawnee County Historical Society. Hope you have a great afternoon. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.